Welcome to another episode in the Improving at Warmachine series. This time we're going to talk about the early game. My name's Ryan. I used to be good at Warmachine. Welcome to Spell Rack. Last episode, we talked about who is the alpha. This time, I would like to discuss a little bit more in depth what happens before that. So, the early game is going to break down into 4 different components here. It's going to be scenario, deployment, turn one, and then on to engagement. And engagement really brings us back into that who is the alpha episode where you are trying to get an alpha engagement. So the first one is going to be scenario. You're going to want to look at the scenario you're playing. Some scenarios play more towards the middle. Some scenarios play wider. Some scenarios are going to be faster and slower. And so you're going to want to kind of take analysis of what that looks like. Obviously, a scenario like two fronts is really going to spread the game out. You're going to have the 50s on the left and the 40s on the right, and it's going to split an army in two. If you have a list that is a little bit more of a turtle or is dependent on buffs, take Windwall buff, for example, especially in Chimera, where it's got a limited range. That list, if you're going into a gun line, is going to be less effective into a scenario like this. Additionally, a gun line could be quite effective in a scenario like this, as you could put pressure on both the 50s and 40s at the same time, because you can leave some units in the middle while moving other units to the sides to actually contest. Best laid plans is going to dictate a very wide game, center included. And so you're going to have to plan for the entire map while trying to be mindful of what's going to disappear, and then everything's going to shift. So that's going to change the pace of your game very quickly. Wolves at our heels is one that can score very quickly. This one, as you're dragging the 40, and depending on where that flag ends up, if you can score the 40 and the flag both pretty easily on your side, and then contest or control the on your turn, you might end up scoring 4 points every turn, and then on your opponent's turn, you might end up scoring 2 more with the flag and the 40. And that spread could lead to a very quick game. So for some of those reasons, you need to take account of what the scenario is as you sit down to the table, and it's going to tell you whether you're playing a fast game or a slow game or a spread out game or not. Now, what you determine as you view the scenario is going to change your deployment strategy. I'm not sure I have a strong opinion on going first or going second. The data on Longshanks over the course of a year says that going first has a 53% win rate, and so it is superior to go first. I know most people choose to go first because they feel like getting up the field is more important. I do find, though, that on scenario, I can be quite threatening when I am going second, though, because I get the first chance to score. You're the first player to put models up. You're going to put your models on the 50s or whatever's in the middle. So depending on what your army wants, you may want to go first or second. That's going to come with some practice. That's hard for me to really help with. The one thing I will say is if the table is very imbalanced, you might be better off choosing to go second so you can pick the right table side. As far as deployment is concerned, though, as I mentioned, it's really going to be based on the scenario. A lot of people, and myself included, tend to deploy fairly symmetrically. I want resources that I can deploy to the left and the right and the center. And a lot of my lists get built with symmetry. I'll have 2 units of X and 2 units of Y, and so 1 unit goes on the left and 1 unit goes on the right. You might also have little modules that work together. Take Deuce and the Black 13th. Deuce is going to get a focus from the Black 13th. All have ways of ignoring, say, stealth, and can put out good ranged fire. All of them have reposition. So you could put them on a flank together to shoot fairly hard and be able to reposition back onto flags or scenario objectives. Something like your mercenaries, be it Noxila or Big Pig, Little Pig, can be very good side pieces that operate on their own and allow you to not dominate, but compete on a side of the table. And so depending on what your list is, you might want to deploy 80 points of your army a little bit left of center while leaving Big Pig on right of center and still being able to approach the game in a balanced way. Largely, though, I think deployment symmetrically towards the middle is probably the right way to go. There are opportunities to experiment where you push really hard left or right. I've tried that again in some games where I'm going second so I can counter deploy. What you can try to do is deploy everything to one side and limit your exposure to the other side. It can be very hard to do and it can cost you scenario, but if you're able to fight 100% of your army on 75% of theirs, you are advantaged for a couple of turns, and then you can try to press that advantage into a scenario victory later on. This again in turn takes us into turn one. Turn one, if you're going first, usually it's pedal to the metal and you're just moving every model as fast as it can go, because most lists can't shoot you if they're going second. Although you need to be mindful of some of those. For myself in Dusk with Helith, my Phantasm can reach 22 inches, walk 6, shoot 16. So if you full run, I'm going to be able to shoot something. And maybe you're okay with that. Maybe you want to let me shoot something, maybe not. But you do need to ask your opponent how far they can reach turn one. If you're going first, yeah, you want to move up as quick as possible so that you have as much table space as possible. It then gives you the option on turn two whether or not you press into your opponent or you back up a little bit. The other thing that going all the way forward does, especially if you're a faster list or a list with a lot of guns, is it makes your opponent make a difficult choice about their first turn. Say you threat 14 inches and you're already up at the mid-table. Your opponent has to decide, do I put models inside of a 14-inch threat range? Which basically means they're not leaving their deployment zone. Or do they kind of dirtle inside of their deployment zone? I've done that myself many a time because I don't want to give up pieces right away. If my opponent moves aggressively on turn one, I'll just kind of sit in my deployment zone so that I don't end up giving up too much. I also have a counter punch that my opponent's going to need to think about. So when you're the first player going second, you're also going to have to decide, now that you're at the mid-table, do you keep pressing and push on scenario quickly? Because what you could do is jam your opponent and try to lock them out of the midfield, giving yourself a significant scenario advantage. Or is your opponent have the 14-inch charge ranges, or do they have good guns, and you need to be mindful of that engagement? And so maybe the first player then backs up. Regardless, it is the second player that's going to get to score first. And so even if you play cagey and stay in your deployment zone, you will have an opportunity to run pieces to, at the very least, contest objectives. And maybe, if your opponent doesn't want to get alphaed too hard, even if you're in your deployment zone, if you've got some 14-inch threat range pieces and you've got some guns, you're going to be able to overtake a few pieces in the middle and score some objectives and get ahead early in the game. I understand that this is all fairly complex and it's easier to see it on the table. I would certainly encourage people, if you're at home and you've got a mat set up and you've got some extra pieces, feel free to set up two different armies and kind of play out your scenario deployment and turn one and see where your pieces are and see what feels comfortable. You don't need to roll dice, right? You can just move pieces around the map really quickly. You could do this online too, of course, just to get a sense of the game. If you know that you have a fast list, for me, it's Dusk and Tyrus, right? Cats run 13 inches with some of the cats placing 2 inches in front of that with a 2-inch base. So that's 17 inches plus my 6-inch deployment zone. I'm 23 inches up the table, and then I threat 16 inches. That is 39 inches across the table. It's only a 48-inch table, which means my opponent only has 9 inches on their side of the table before they're being charged by cats. Setting this stuff up at home and trying to play out turn one is going to be helpful. The other item about deployment and turn one is, depending on how synergistic your army is, you need to practice unpacking your pieces. If you have a Chimeratrix that shuts down spells, it only works within 3 inches. And you need to be very careful about what you want inside of that 3-inch bubble. Are you going second? Does your opponent have an arc node that they've run on turn one, and therefore you need to be careful of spells on turn two? You need to be careful about unpacking that list. Do you have a Warcaster with Fog of War, but only a 12-inch control range? You need to be careful about how much of your list is out on the flanks that might have prowl and need concealment. There's a lot of defensive buffs that you're going to want to be careful with that you'll need to unpack carefully. You need to be mindful of where your shield guards are going to go. Again, practicing at home just by yourself with unpacking your army is going to make this execution a lot cleaner on the table. It's also going to save you a lot of time on clock. The last item here is engagement, and I have already touched on this, obviously. The way you approach turn one and your deployment is going to affect how your armies engage. And this goes back to if you're going first and you're running very quickly, you're likely going to press engagement faster. Because you're at the midline or very close to the midline, you're either going to ask your opponent to move up and meet you so that you can charge. And if your opponent has a very tanky list, they might just do that. And then you have a choice as the first player. Do you back up and yield space, or do you alpha into them? This is also going to determine based on players' feats. If you're Horusk and you're going second, you might full run at your opponent and meet them at the mid table with your feet up so that you're +3 armor. Same thing for Gravediggers with Vargas, or even a Kythos with a +3 defense feat effectively. You might answer your opponent's turn one by running aggressively yourself. If you do that turn one, though, the fear is that your opponent can just back up. Now, if you're going second and you answer aggressively and your opponent backs up, it gives you a significant advantage on scenario. And you might be able to just take up enough table space and go ahead on scenario fast enough that it could bring you to a very quick and swift scenario win. Again, these engagement tools are significantly benefited by playing this out on the table. If you have some friends, you can even run through some of these scenarios with them. I would strongly advocate talking through your turns. If your opponent moves first aggressively and you move aggressively as the second player, and then they alpha you off the table, well, you just learned a lesson. You can talk through that and reset, back up a little bit as the second player, and then make the first player now make a harder decision. Talking through these turns, you could even ask your opponent, what are you more worried about right now? Me moving forward or me moving backwards, right? If I back up outside of your threat ranges and I don't give you any charges, what are you going to do? Are you just going to stand still? Are you going to back up? Do they have enough models to consistently contest scenarios since you're the second player and you're going to be scoring first? So TLDR through this entire thing, I guess, is sit down at home with a table, put models on the table, and get a feel for scenarios, deployments, unpacking turn one, and how you'll approach engagement. Get a small feel for that, and then sit down with a friend, and instead of going through the game, you can run and rerun the first couple of turns. Just see what feels comfortable about your setups against various different lists, be it if you're playing a gunline or a melee list or a combined arms list, if you're playing a scenario that is faster or slower, or if you're playing a scenario that is widespread versus a little bit more focused on the middle. Though this was a very theoretical episode, I hope thinking out loud with a lot of this is helpful to you and you're able to practice this on your own so that you can execute better in your next game. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please like and subscribe. Until next time.